So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are jumping right back into the source material for the Rethink History series, Salad Bowl of the World.
Right, and today we're looking at episode 8, titled Ice.
Exactly. And, to really grasp this history, you have to start by picturing the actual physical problem. When you look at a head of Chris head lettuce, you are essentially looking at a water balloon wrapped in leaves.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
it's roughly 95% water.
Right, 95%. So just think about the mechanics of that. It presents this massive, almost impossible logistical dilemma for anyone trying to sell the stuff. Because you take a knife, you cut that head of lettuce in a field, say, just a few miles from the Monterey Bay.
And it doesn't just stop living at that moment.
No, it actively respires. The customer who is actually going to pay for that delicate water balloon, well, they live 3,000 miles away.
Right, in places like Chicago or Boston. And that's a week's train ride to the east.
A full week. So if you take this freshly cut, warm lettuce, which, by the way, is generating its own internal heat because it's still alive, and you seal it in a dark boxcar in the middle of July to cross the desert, you don't end up with a salad on the East Coast.
No, absolutely not. You end up with literal compost.
Yes, compost, just steaming sludge by the time that train hits Nevada.
Which is really the core of what we are doing here today. The whole story, the entire agricultural empire of the Salinas Valley was built out of the answer to that exact problem. And the answer was ice.
Frozen water.
Exactly. This deep dive is the story of block ice, crushed ice, and just, everything that ice built in the valley between the First and Second World Wars.
Well, let's get into the beginnings then, like between 1916 and 1930. Because before you can even ship a water balloon across a continent, you need the right vessel, and the vessel was the plant itself.
That's a great way to put it. You couldn't ship the local leaf or butter lettuces. They were way too delicate.
Right. You had to eat those practically in the exact same zip code they were grown in. So the valley had to fundamentally shift to this sturdy cabbage-like plant, the Chris head.
Its physical durability was really its only saving grace. It was the only reason it could survive that week-long beating on the rails. And that shift, it sparked a staggering boom.
The numbers are actually wild.
They really are. If you look at the sources, in 1922, there were just 175 acres of lettuce planted in the entire valley.
175.
Yeah, tiny. But fast forward to 1930, so just 8 years later, and you are looking at more than 43,000 acres. By the 1930 to 1931 season, Monterey County was shipping roughly 20,000 rail cars of lettuce a year. It became nearly half of everything the county's farms earned.
Okay, wait, let's unpack that for a second, because that growth curve is just, it actually stopped me in my tracks when I read it. How do you just instantly switch an entire valley's agriculture?
It does seem impossible, right?
Yeah. It feels like waking up one morning and deciding, I don't know, a neighborhood that manufactures bicycles is suddenly going to build commercial airplanes. You don't just magically have the infrastructure for a 40,000 acre expansion out of nowhere.
Well, you don't start from scratch. The secret there was actually the ghost of a previous industry.
Oh, the sugar beets.
Exactly. The fields in the Salinas Valley were already leveled out. They had these extensive irrigation ditches ready to go, and the deep wells were already drilled and pumping.
All built for the sugar beet boom from the earlier era?
Right. So when the sugar beet market kind of shifted and became less profitable, the valley was basically a turnkey factory. It was just sitting there waiting for a better crop.
The stage was totally set. But it's funny, the historical record gets incredibly murky when you try to pinpoint the exact moment it started.
It's highly contested.
Yeah, the sources honestly just fight each other on the very first shipments. Some historians point to, like, a single wagon load of lettuce leaving for San Francisco around 1916.
But then, if you look for the first commercial plantings and the first refrigerated carloads heading east, the dates scatter anywhere from 1920 to 1922.
Yeah, and nobody can definitively agree on who actually shipped that very first carload. The Pioneer is basically lost to history.
Which is a fascinating gap, considering the massive scale of what it turned into. But whoever it was, they really kicked off a mechanical revolution.
Right, because once they committed to the Chris head, they had to figure out how to keep a rolling wooden box cold for a week. And insulating it wouldn't work because the lettuce is generating heat. You'd just be making a slow oven.
Exactly. And that physical reality forced them to rely on the Pacific Fruit Express, or the PFE bunker refrigerator car.
Which was a beast of a machine.
It really was. This wasn't just like a cold room. It was an active cooling engine. Picture a 40-foot insulated wooden boxcar. At each end, there were these dedicated bunkers.
And the process of loading those is just staggering to think about.
Yeah, workers would literally climb up onto the roof of the train and drop massive 300-pound cakes of block ice down through the hatches.
300-pound blocks. Just imagine the sheer impact of those hitting the metal grates down inside.
Right, and the air would chill around the blocks, sink down, circulate through the floor racks underneath the lettuce, absorb the heat, and then rise back into the bunkers. But even that wasn't enough.
Because you've got 14 to 16 tons of sweating, respiring lettuce in there.
Right, so they had to go further, which led to the practice of top icing.
This is the part that blew my mind. They would take roughly 20,000 pounds of crushed ice.
20,000 pounds.
And they'd use these massive hoses to just blow it directly over the top of the packed wooden crates inside the car. It was practically a 1-to-1 ratio of ice to plant.
And that ice was not cheap. It cost about $60 a load.
Which was a huge expense back then.
Massive. And that $60 really only got the train out of town. Because think about the geography you have to cross.
Right. Leaving California for the East Coast, you are going straight into the Mojave Desert, Utah, Wyoming, Nebraska, often in July or August.
The desert gauntlet. That initial load of ice would just melt away.
So they needed to be re-iced roughly once a day as they crossed the country. And the sheer physical labor of that is wild. I mean, the sources describe these major re-icing stops, like the ones in Roseville, California.
Oh, the icing decks?
Yeah. They had these quarter-mile-long wooden platforms built at the exact height of the train roofs. You had hundreds of icemen working around the clock in the blazing sun.
With giant metal tongs and heavy picks.
Exactly, just manhandling these slick, freezing 300-pound blocks onto trains that were basically baking in the heat.
The human labor required to maintain that artificial winter on rails is just incredible. And back in Salinas, that massive need for ice birthed a whole new kind of architecture, the packing shed.
The factory on the rail spur.
Right, because you couldn't pack this stuff out in the dirt. You needed these long, specialized buildings running parallel to the tracks. The lettuce would come in from the fields, get dumped in the sheds, and then this huge workforce took over.
Trimmers stripping the leaves, packers cramming the heads into pine crates and shoving them full of ice before loading them onto the PFE cars.
Yeah.
You know, our compiler for these sources, Nick McKenzie, he actually included a brief personal observation here that I thought was really nice.
Oh, really? What did he say?
Well, just speaking from the male perspective of someone who grew up around there, he noted that he has driven past these old sheds and cooler buildings along the Southern Pacific tracks in Salinas since 1988.
Wow.
Yeah, and he says they are mostly ghosts now, just these long buildings built for a completely bygone era, although he did mention there's one ice company out there that still tops produce with ice under its original name.
That's a stubborn holdout right there. But it shows how the industrial architecture really outlives the industry itself.
Absolutely. The valley still wears the skeleton of the ice era. But, you know, the ice didn't just leave buildings behind. The sheer volume of this stuff traveling across the country literally changed the American vocabulary.
Right, it gave us the permanent name, iceberg lettuce.
Which I love because it brings up this great collision between folk history and documented fact.
The legends versus the record.
Exactly, and the folk legend is so vivid. The story goes that Eastern children standing on these train platforms in places like Maine would see these frozen rail cars pulling into the station.
Dripping wet and covered in frost.
Right, and the kids would shout, "The icebergs are coming! The icebergs are coming!" And supposedly that spontaneous childhood wonder is how the lettuce got its name.
It is a highly cinematic story. A girl in Maine naming an entire industry.
It's great.
It is, but the historical record tells a much drier story, unfortunately.
Yeah.
W. Atlee Burpee and Company, which was a major seed house in Philadelphia, they were already selling a seed called Iceberg in their 1894 catalog.
1894.
Yeah, calling it a handsome cabbage lettuce. Decades before the first refrigerated train ever left Salinas. We even have newspaper ads in Wisconsin selling it back in 1891.
Okay, I freely admit that the legend is infinitely better than the record.
It usually is.
But the record stands. Although, to be fair to the legend, shipping tens of thousands of ice-topped cars every year is what cemented that name in the American mind. When you are the massive dominant vehicle delivering the product, you make Iceberg the only lettuce that matters.
Absolutely. The trains made it famous.
Yeah.
And with that product named, and the ice flowing at that industrial scale, we start to see a new power structure emerge in the valley.
The integrated grower shipper.
Right, these weren't just farmers handing off their crop.
Bruce Church is like the perfect avatar for this. Born in 1900, the story goes he borrowed $3,000 in 1926, packed his first crop under ice, and supposedly saw a return of $100,000.
It is the ultimate agricultural boomtown story. But if we are being even-handed, we really need to steelman the position of these grower shippers, because the financial risk they took on was terrifying.
It really was. Let's walk through it for a second. You are planting a crop on a total guess about what people in New York are going to want to eat months later.
Right.
You pay the wages, you buy the pine crates, you pay that $60 ice fee, you pay the railroad freight. All of this capital leaves your bank account before you have any idea what the final price will be in the East.
Because they were shipping on consignment, they just trusted an Eastern broker to sell it at the daily market rate.
Which meant sometimes a grower didn't get a check back at all. Sometimes they got a bill because the lettuce sold for less than the cost of the freight and the ice.
John Steinbeck actually captured this perfectly in his novel, East of Eden.
Oh, right, the delayed train.
Yeah, a character ships lettuce east on ice, but the train gets delayed by unseasonable heat. The ice melts, and the shipment turns into, quote, 6 carloads of horrible slop with a sizable charge just to get rid of it.
They were literally paying to throw away their own ruined crop.
Exactly. So they bore almost the entire market risk. But of course, we have to hold that immense financial risk right beside the reality of the workforce.
The shed and field wages.
Right. The prosperity of the valley's elite families relied entirely on the thousands of workers cutting the lettuce and wrestling those 300-pound ice blocks on the decks.
It's a massive tension between the guy writing the check for the ice and the guy physically moving it in the sun.
And it's a tension we'll leave unresolved here, but it's crucial context. Now, to manage all that risk and keep the expensive infrastructure running, these powerful families, names like Church, Merrill, Nutting, Hardin, Dorigo, and Antle, they had to organize.
They couldn't just sit idle for half the year when Salinas got too cold for lettuce.
No, so 4 of them actually founded an ice company together. And then, in the summer of 1930, they formed the Grower-Shipper Vegetable Association.
Which led to one of the craziest logistical feats, the seasonal shuttle.
They moved an entire industry with the sun.
Literally. When temperatures dropped in Salinas, the growers, the packers, the field crews, all of them just migrated south to the Imperial Valley and to Yuma, Arizona.
A migratory circuit just following the perfect temperature band for a fragile plant. And Bruce Church's life really mirrors that reality right up to the very end.
Though naturally for this deep dive, even his death is a subject of contested records.
Of course it is.
He died of a heart attack in 1958. But if you look at a prominent memorial site, it claims he died at a convention in Los Angeles.
But the contemporary sources say otherwise.
Right. Yeah, if you pull the Arizona Republic newspaper from the exact day he died, it reports he suffered that fatal heart attack at a growers' meeting in Yuma.
Right on the winter end of the shuttle he helped create.
It's poignant.
It really is. And it brings us to a final thought on this whole era. There's this brutal rule in industrial agriculture. Every grand solution eventually becomes the next fatal problem.
The massive packing sheds, the ice plants, the jobs, the ice built the empire, but it couldn't protect itself.
Exactly. All of that vibrant ecosystem was completely wiped out by the next technological leap.
Vacuum cooling.
Right, in the late 1940s.
The physics of it are brilliant but devastating to the old way of life. They figured out how to drive trucks loaded with freshly cut lettuce right into these massive sealed steel tubes.
And they would literally suck the air out of the tube.
Right, dropping the atmospheric pressure so dramatically that the moisture inside the lettuce would boil at room temperature.
And that rapid evaporation just sucked the field heat right out of the core of the plant.
Instantly. No ice required at all. Suddenly you didn't need the massive wooden sheds on the rail spur. You didn't need the elaborate pine crates and paper.
You could just pack the lettuce into cheap cardboard cartons out in the dirt of the field, run it through the vacuum tube, and load it on a train.
The physical solution of the ice block was totally erased by the invisible solution of the vacuum. The sheds became the ghosts that Nick McKenzie drives past today.
And those thousands of jobs tied to the ice just vanished.
It's wild to think about. But it perfectly sets the stage for where we are heading next, because now that we know how this perishable water balloon was physically kept alive for 3,000 miles, we need to look at the other side of the equation.
Logistics is only half the battle. How was it actually sold once it got there?
Exactly. So, in episode 9, Making the Market, we are going to dive into the wild west of the eastern terminals.
Oh, that's going to be a good one.
We'll get into the widespread abuses of the consignment system, the fight for shipping point pricing, and the sheer drama of rolling cars being diverted mid-continent via telegraph just to chase a rumor of a better price in Chicago.
Plus, we'll talk about the Stanford economist William O. Jones. Our compiler actually studied under him, and Jones is the guy who managed to turn a Salinas lettuce field into a literal textbook on market economics.
So definitely come back for that, because the next time you see a crisp head of iceberg lettuce in the store, remember you aren't just looking at a salad ingredient.
You are looking at the legacy of a quarter-mile icing deck, 20,000 pounds of crushed ice, and the ghost of an empire.
Like and subscribe. It really helps the channel reach others.